Hey everyone, welcome to episode 1 of Surviving Social Isolation. We're all in this together. My name is Stephanie. I have a background in child and youth care counseling, and this is my other host, Haley.
Hi, I'm Haley. I have a background in psychology and specifically working with children with disabilities such as learning disabilities and autism. We are both currently enrolled in the Humber Addictions and Mental Health program. And so while this podcast is going to be accessible to the masses, that is its intention. It is focusing mostly on mental health and addiction, and specifically how social isolation affects those things. And let's just get into it. Welcome to episode 1. We're basically just going to be in this episode covering social isolation as a concept and various things that affect it, benefit it, make it harder, all that good stuff. This first episode, as well as this podcast in general, is talking about social isolation. So I think we both kind of know that the definition of social isolation is just that. It's socially isolated. So, I think a better way to sort of talk about it, rather than having a hard and fast definition, we talk about our own experiences. So like, what is your experience with social isolation?
I first think about when I was working overseas in a country where I didn't speak the language. I felt really socially isolated. I was surrounded by people, but I couldn't communicate, and it was all facial pleasantries, which worked, but at the end of the day, I was still really alone. And so for me, that's what I think about when I think about my experience, social isolation. You could be surrounded by people, you could be living and doing your daily life, but you still just feel alone.
Yeah, I think that's a really good, tangible experience. I think while other people haven't necessarily been to another country and been completely cut off, language wise and communication wise, I think the idea of oh yeah, I'm surrounded by people who do not speak the same language as me, and therefore I can't just talk about what I watched on TV. I can't do anything other than communicate the bare necessities of I'm having a good day, I'm having a bad day. My experience with social isolation is much less tangible than that, because when I think of social isolation, I think of growing up as a queer person in the Catholic Church, and not being able to really talk about my experiences, not really being able to exist as myself publicly for most of my life. And that feeling of just being ooh, I'm not welcome here. For me, social isolation is sort of that idea where, again, you're surrounded by people, but kind of in your experience, it's not so much that you can't communicate, it's that you can't be authentic. You can't exist in that way, kind of like the social pariah. So people who are a part of community but are shunned from community.
Well, again, when I first think about social isolation, I think about feral children. I think about what would happen if we are completely isolated. First, I think what happens to our development. The second thing I think about is what are our responses? So those who feel really isolated, I think it can really highly connect with addiction and substance use, especially because this past year, or the past 2 years with COVID, we've really kind of viewed social isolation with being socially distanced.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's very similar themes that occur in both, but like you said, social isolation can come from communities.
Right.
And can I actually be a part of the space, which is very different, I think, with our thinking about being social distance is socially isolated.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's a really good jumping off point for me to do my first rant on this podcast. I spent probably a grand total of like 5 hours the other day reading through different research papers and things that are like specifically talking about the conceptual idea of social isolation. And all of them come to this same conclusion, which is that perceived social isolation, so the perception that you as an individual are socially isolated and do not have access to community or other individuals in like a like-minded way, is more detrimental to your physical and mental well-being than actually being physically separated from other people. And I just sat there being like, okay, so it's worse to be lonely than to be alone. Cool. Thanks for clearing that up, science.
I know. And it's also just like whenever you look up social isolation, I always feel like they're trying to sell me something.
Yeah, and it's not trying to sell me mental health care. It's trying to sell me skincare products.
Yeah,
It's trying to sell
exactly.
me bath bombs. It's trying to sell me scented candles. It's like, I don't need that.
I feel like I'm being life coached by the internet and by the ads. It's,
Yeah.
oh. Is there any other things that you're excited to explore about social isolation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I'm kind of most excited to really look into is social isolation in relation to like social media. Just because like obviously during COVID, we've all had access to Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and Twitter and all of that kind of stuff. But so for a lot of people, the like daily communication bit maybe hasn't changed that much because they're still texting their friends, they're still calling their parents, they're still doing all these things. And yet it still feels like you're alone. It still feels like you're socially isolated. Yeah. So I'm interested, I'm really interested to look into and talk more about social isolation kind of in relation to social media and in relation to like digital communication, just because I feel like it's a thing that we have in our current day and age, which makes it really easy to stay connected, but it also it's sort of like junk food socialization, where like you could eat as much as you want, but it's not actually providing you anything productive.
I really like that. Yeah. And especially because with tech and social media, like just a few months ago, and it's still very, very valid, like FOMO.
Yeah,
And we still have all of this social anxiety connected with social media, but for the pandemic, a lot of us relied on that.
yeah,
And so we're feeling really social, but at the same time, I think screen fatigue, I think it was so complicated. I think I'm really excited as well to talk about how do we socialize in a
yeah,
meaningful way.
yeah. I think this all kind of circles back to the research findings of perceived isolation. It's that perception, it's that like understanding of your own reality that is really what affects you.
I agree with you because it's not like
Yeah.
social isolation is just this confined feeling that we're having because of COVID. Like we see it with our seniors, we see it again with marginalized populations and people.
Another thing that I am really interested to look into, and we might not be able to talk about it too much, but especially now that we're kind of on the back end of COVID and people are getting vaccinated and are slowly kind of like going back to work and going back to school and going back to like drinking on patios. There's a really interesting thing that's happening where all of the people who um all the people who were in COVID and in lockdown who are now leaving lockdown are actually struggling just as much with going back into
Mm,
socializing as they were with leaving it. And there's this interesting disconnect or like discrepancy where when we went into lockdown, everybody was like, we're all in this together. We're all gonna, everyone here's what you should do to self-care. Here's what you should do to like keep yourself alive and keep yourself safe and rested and recovered. But now that everyone's just kind of going back, people are doing it individually, and there isn't the same kind of camaraderie and and like community around going back into society. And I think that that's interesting, but also is detrimental to people's health.
for sure. It was like the gates opened and some people were so excited and other people like, what is out there? Like,
Yeah,
how do we do this? And
yeah, exactly. And I think, like, especially around the pandemic, a thing that's a core tenet of what this social isolation looks like and what it means and all that kind of stuff is really that it's just fundamental change. And so going from, working 40 hours a week and being in school an equal amount of time and all that good stuff, and then basically just turning that off, like full stop, and then being expected to turn it back on without anybody kind of holding your hand through the process. I think that's really hard, because like change is hard. And like most people, while certain people have better ability to adapt to change, I feel like most people struggle with big changes like that to a degree.
Yeah, we're going to talk about a lot of very interesting stuff, and I'm very excited.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this podcast will be one of those things that's like, that is going to be both cathartic for us and like insightful for anyone who's listening.
So, fingers crossed.
That's what we can hope for. Thank you so much for listening. This has been Surviving Social Isolation. We are going to have some resources and some activities listed down below. There's going to be a link to a Google Drive with a bunch of fun stuff and a bunch of useful resources. Next week, we are going to be diving a little bit deeper into the impacts of social isolation, specifically around specific age groups and demographics. But again, thank you so much for listening. I'm Haley.
I'm Stephanie.
And we'll see you next week. Bye.